You could say that 2023 has not been a happy year for human rights in the world, as gender violence continues to worsen in Nigeria and elsewhere, along with the trafficking of women and girls. It's been a particularly unhappy year for the people of Gaza as Israel closes in, and for morale in Ukraine as winter and Russia grip the Ukrainian front lines. As the world marks 75 years this week since the Universal Human Rights Declaration was adopted by the United Nations in 1948, why can't the UN do more to get the kind of world peace most of us long for? How can the United Nations make itself into a beacon of progressive power that safeguards freedoms, supports the oppressed, and prevents conflict and human rights abuses, so that its pronouncements may echo across the peaks and valleys of the world? At a time when the organization's role is in question and serious breaches of the Universal Human Rights Convention are occurring, has the UN become just a powerless talking shop? Well, for more on this, I'm joined now in the studio by the international human rights activist and senior advocate of Nigeria, Professor Joy Ezeilo, OON, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. She's also the Emeritus Dean of Law at the University of Nigeria, is recognized globally as a legal authority in international human rights, and was announced by the BBC in 2022 as one of 100 women of impact in the world. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much, Charles, for that.
Lovely to have you. I know you were very busy, so we really appreciate your taking the time to come in.
Yeah.
And when we look at a place like Gaza, for example, many people wonder why the UN can't get the kind of peace that we all long for there. Is it the structure of the UN that gets in the way? Because, I mean, we've got a post-Second World War order, and the new balances of power don't seem to be reflected in the UN structure.
Yes, UN is a very complex situation because, you know, it's Committee of Nations that are members of United Nations. And at the beginning, from the UN Charter of 1945, they established 6 organs, of which one is Security Council. And then over time, they have expanded the membership of that, but we still know the 5 that can veto any vote. And those 5 include, of course, France, UK, US, Russia, and China. And that has become a stumbling block, even in terms of making progress, or UN wielding the big stick. UN is supposed to not to pander to any country, to be an independent, you know, fostering relationships, you know, it's in a friendly way, and ensuring international peace and security, as well as promoting human rights and working with member states to solve it. You know, problems such as Gaza, such as conflicts and human rights violation in other parts of the world. But the structure, you know, of the UN, especially even the Security Council, have kind of paralyzed it. So the paralysis continues with any decision. Look at Ukraine. When also the vote came up in Security Council for ceasefire, Russia vetoed. This time again with Gaza, they vetoed. So it's almost sometimes like mission impossible. And when you look at it, people feel that the UNO is far removed and it doesn't really, the help doesn't come, and then they come maybe afterwards in terms of post reconstruction or UN mission. But I think people should also understand the world will be worse without UN. I'm not saying that we are where we're supposed to be with UN has become a site for that dialogue, for ensuring peaceful resolution of conflict. But we've seen a lot of, you know, quagmire, stalemates, and not progressing. Just look at also the same way with Libya, the same way with Syria, with Yemen. Those are intractable, you know, kind of conflicts. But one want to see more action, and that might mean actually new architecture in terms of Security Council, which we are sure they will resist. The power brokers is about regional and those powerful, major powerful interests that is causing the problem.
Well, I mean, we'll get to the issue of reform because it's a very nettlesome question at the moment. But even in places where the UN was allowed in, I mean, they're being thrown out. I mean, in Mali, for instance, the UN has today officially ended its 10-year deployment there, known as MINUSMA.
Yeah, the UN mission.
The Mali government had asked the UN to withdraw its troops because of the perceived ineffectiveness of the UN force.
Yeah, you know, because they have to be as strong as the member state. And if you look at the crisis the world is facing today, world economic disorder, conflicts all over the place, you will see that they are really spread too thin, and then the money is not actually there. You can see even the humanitarian assistance, they have to cut down and cut a lot of budget. So it's also tight for them to be everywhere. And sometimes, even though they promote, they're supposed to bring member states together, harmonize position, but you see that's countries, because they are sovereign. Even though
they assert their sovereignty.
Exactly,
basically.
And that sovereignty, even though they've given part to UN. And then by saying we will work in collaboration with international cooperation to achieve the purpose for which United Nations was formed. But at times they claim sovereignty. And it's one person, one vote, even in the General Assembly. So they will say, we don't want you here. And there is nothing they can do. But they can, of course, they have other ways. Probably member states could sanction. And they could appoint other special procedure mechanism, including international fact-finding mission and all of that, and which I think is one of the ways UN now, especially when it comes to human rights, is beginning to effectively work, because those are independent and not bogged down by the institutional problems.
I mean, we're going to get to all that in a minute, but I mean, there was a time when people felt that the UN had a duty to step in to bring wars like, you know, the ones in Gaza and Ukraine to a stop. I mean, that is, after all, what the UN was intended to do when it was first sort of planned while the Second World War, I understand, was at its height.
Exactly.
But that doesn't seem to happen anymore. I mean, do you agree with those who, I mean, I know you work for the UN and you still do things with them. I mean, has the UN become a powerless talking shop?
I wouldn't say so, but again, there are disappointments which I also share in, because it's not just, even at times UN staff may be sent packing in countries and UN is incapacitated in doing something. It happened in Uganda, the human rights expert, it happened also in Ethiopia. Some staff were just, but the world will be worse, will not be safer place even without UN.
Right.
Because they still come together, countries still feel
yes, I understand that.
We have to still respect, especially when decisions are taken. But just getting to that decisions could be very, very difficult because of the powerful interest.
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right. But clearly, I mean, looking at what it was intended to be, politically, strategically, as a venue for collective security, a place where peace can be agreed, conflicts can be resolved. I mean, the UN it appears to be diminishing, not getting stronger.
It's really politics. And it's a lot of politics, not just in the UN, even in equivalent regional bodies, whether you're looking at African Union, probably the most sophisticated maybe European Union. If you're looking at the Inter-American system, you're looking at ECOWAS, so you can see the paralysis, even with ECOWAS taking action against coup d'etats and countries that have, and you can see the way they are coming into alliance. This is what the world has become. Coming after the Second World War, people were like determined, never again are we going to have this situation. And they collectively empower the UN. But you can see that power is also decreasing. The belief and trust is also dwindling. And with that also means that some states just don't want to comply, even to pay their dues as well, to the peacekeeping. And they've failed in a number of ways anyway. But they have also succeeded in some ways in other places.
Yeah, I mean, you made an interesting point that there's still a large part of the UN machinery that's delivering, for instance, humanitarian aid. And of course, there is the work that people like you have been doing and have done as UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons and that kind of thing.
The refugees, the IDPs,
yeah.
quite a lot.
You know, but do you agree with those who say that these are just sticking plasters and that the UN seems incapable of stopping the problems that led to the humanitarian crisis in the first place and the human rights abuses and so on?
You know, international law and international relations, you know, especially international relations, which also part of what UN kind becomes a site, you know, for the struggle for all of this, inclusion to be or not to be, and the powerful states meddling. It has become like a shoestring. So sometimes they don't get it, you know. Sometimes also people have the political leadership and economic will to push forward. So there is a number of things that definitely they have challenges, and I think as an institution is well recognized. But also you see also a system of humanitarian assistance that is very sophisticated. You can also see the food hunger program, you know, very well advanced. You can see the refugee. But they are overwhelmed as well. And thinly stretched, you know, so those are the problem. But
well,
really,
I hope you know we're not holding you to. I mean,
of course, no, I'm not even representing.
Yeah.
Definitely, I
but,
don't
but
have
I mean,
any
obviously, you know better because you've worked for the
position
UN.
I hold with the UN is mainly as an independent expert most of the time, and then consultant.
But I mean,
I'm not.
No, I understand that.
UN,
but if you take Russia's territorial invasion of Ukraine, for example, I mean, you touched on this earlier. Which I mean, what is striking for most people is that they are members of the Security Council, which is the most powerful body in the UN, and yet what they have done appears to go against all the precepts of the United Nations, the UN Charter, etc.
All the international laws. And I agree that actually they must revisit even the charter itself, even the legal framework, and make it certain that if those that are permanent members of Security Council will lose their permanency if they undertake an action that threatens the world peace. Because now they are invoking Article 99 of the UN Charter, that when peace, international peace and security is threatened, that's what under which the resolution being proposed for ceasefire emanated. It's really, there should be stronger sanctions for those power blocks if they tend to constitute also a problem, for the UN, which it is what we have. I can't imagine having any resolution against China that will ever pass, or against Russia or US interests or any of these blocks.
That's why they call it a powerless talking show.
Exactly.
But I mean, you know the organization well. You work with them. You worked for them. Is there any possibility of changing the UN? Because, I mean, everybody pays lip service to reform, but ultimately it never gets going, does it? Yeah, because there is a number of what is required, especially for reforms that have to do with Security Council. Even negotiating any treaty in the UN, takes a lot of time because of disparate interests, as you can understand, and multilateral treaties are not easy to agree. But the restructuring must happen. A new architecture and a firmer laws with regard to relationships, as they try to build that friendly relations, they must define also the clear duties and obligation of member states to respect certain fundamental rules, like Article 55, where they said they all commit themselves to joint and separate action in promoting the achievement of the goals of United Nations. But you can see that's not happening. But it's never going to happen, is it? I mean, because it appears like Mission Impossible. Well, if you've got very powerful nations, I mean, look at the International Criminal Court, for example. It'll always be limited to places like Africa, maybe some countries in Asia, Latin America, because, I mean, none of the others are signatories. And if you say to Russia or the US, you must do this or else, they'll just leave the United Nations.
Exactly, and even within African countries, you're seeing that. If you see the Human Rights Court in Africa, in Arusha, some member states have left.
Yeah.
And then you see some who say they are not parties to it. Even International Court of Justice, Cameroon just dragged Nigeria. It was the time it signed on to that because it brought Nigeria before that. Nigeria could have said, okay, I'm not participating, and nothing will happen. But once you participate and a decision is given, you are bound by it.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. It works for some. It has become also a voice for the voiceless, no doubt. And it has played a role, even a major role in the past in terms of self-determination, recognizing, even look at what happened with the South Sudan and Sudan, and even recognition of state. Those would not have been possible, without UN. But then certain ceasefires, could be possible. Look at Eritrea and Ethiopia. There are also good examples of also successful work without holding brief for the UN where they have succeeded. And I said that the special procedure mechanism where they use independent experts outside the civil service within the UN, it works, and it works pretty well.
Well, let's turn to human rights.
Because with that, they can hold the state to account.
Right. Let's turn to Human Rights Day, which I think took place over the weekend. And the fact that this week marks 75 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A lot of the work you do is in that area. You're recognized as a legal authority in international human rights. How have you been marking those two very seminal moments?
Yeah, in fact, it started even since November 24th and 25th was UN Day for elimination of all forms of violence against women, and 10th December, the Human Rights Day. But apart from the UN Human Rights Day, this one fell on Sunday yesterday. We've been having activities since over a week. I'm also a member of Nigerian Bar Association Human Rights Institute. We've held a lot of press conference meetings, National Human Rights Commission we've all participated and spoken in it. Yesterday, actually, I had a symposium that also looking at it, and then also looking at means to enjoyment of human rights. Because oftentimes, with human rights comes the state responsibility. And state responsibility an obligation to protect, to respect, and to remedy, and or fulfill human rights. Which is where it's not about ratification of the human rights treaties or normative framework. What do you do with it to ensure that individuals that are subject to those rights in their respective countries at municipal levels, at local level, at community levels, enjoy those rights? And that's where we have problem. Because countries like Nigeria, we are still dealing with raw, crude human rights, or the very basic about right to life, which you can see is abrogated wantonly. Life has become so cheap. The role of government in terms of protection of lives and property, you're simply on your own. And when it comes to right to food, right to shelter, right to decent employment so that they can have sustainable livelihood. These are right, because it's not enough to say you have right to life and then there is no right to health care or to medical care that will help to sustain that lives. Then it's meaningless without the housing, the shelter, the food, the access to medical care. So I am not happy where we are, even in terms of the world, in terms of Africa, and also at home here in Nigeria.
Right.
Human rights look like we're still in rhetorics, and we need to ensure
it's at a very primitive level.
Very primitive level.
But so in that regard, tell us about the work that you're currently doing to do with the human rights and the rights of women and children and all the rest of it.
What is understanding the standards in human rights? Recently, we were having 6th Judicial Colloquium in Algeria, and I was invited to speak just 2 weeks ago. It's important to emphasize the role of everyone, all arms of government, whether judiciary, in upholding and enforcing fundamental human rights as recognized in the Constitution and in international regional treaties as well. It is important that legislators understand their role in terms of transformation of those international treaties to become applicable at domestic level. It's important also that even the executive understand their role in ensuring and funding and supporting enforcement of human rights, including human rights education. So when you look at that, you find that even people I recall the chair of the drafting committee of that Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948, Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the president then, said
of the United States.
Yes, unless human rights, universal human rights have meaning in places that we can't detect on the map of the world, it will have no meaning anywhere else. And if you look at it, people are not even aware, and if you oppress too much, at a stage you don't even know what is your right. You don't recognize those rights, and you can't respond to those rights. And if you look at unmet justice needs of people, it's very huge. And what I've been doing in terms of standard, how do people understand the standard? The human rights standards. You see, because it's still not compulsory in all universities or at all levels of education, and even for the judges, for legislators to understand and to ensure that this is implemented, that we've moved beyond the categories or prioritizing maybe civil and political over socioeconomic rights. That today we have right to environment, we have right to development. How do we take advantage of scientific, technological advancement? They're all part of it. Right to water, right to sanitation. It has expanded, and even the climate justice, for example. So I am working, in terms of training and building capacity of key stakeholders in administration of justice to understand that even in criminal justice, human rights can be integrated. They are not inconsistent. So also I'm working with, through WACOL, importantly in providing legal aid. And that was even what our seminar was about.
And what does WACOL stand for?
Women's Aid Collective, which I was the founding director in 1997. It's 26 years old today, this year. And it has provided legal aid to not less than 63,000 women and children. And the whole essence is that, how do people enforce their right? If you say I have a right, where do I seek justice? If my right is violated or threatened, how do I go about it? And we find that people who are vulnerable and the poor are mostly affected, because without maybe legal aid, such as we provide, without certain support, including medical, psychosocial counseling, even for women who are, for example, victims of violence, whether sexual violence, without things like shelter, psychological support, they will not get the justice they need. They will not survive their victimization. So it is important. And government is not investing. The theme of this year is, for example, the global is investing in order to prevent violence against women, because it costs nation. If you put the cost, it's over 1.5 trillion. Per annum in terms of the cost to countries. So it makes economic sense even to work towards prevention. So legal aid, we found that many women whose rights, and even children who are violated, house help phenomenon, disinheritance, rape, defilement, incest, and whatever we think doesn't happen in our environment, all happen, and these days people are beginning to rape and kill everything. So people need support, even through the criminal justice system.
And that's what you're providing.
Exactly, that's the kind of support we provide.
Well, I want to thank you very much indeed, and to congratulate you on the work that you're doing. It's a very, very important thing that you're doing, and I hope Nigeria appreciates it, and the rest of the world. Professor Joy Ezeilo is an international human rights activist, senior advocate of Nigeria, former UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. She's also the Emeritus Dean at the University of Nigeria and is recognized globally as a legal authority in international human rights, and last but not least was announced by the BBC in 2022 as one of 100 women of impact in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you.